There's one emerging market that I've been hearing is the next big thing for years, and a lot of big investors are going there. Today, we're going to tell you if this Central Asian country is the next big place to invest. When legendary investor Jim Rogers came to speak at our annual event, Nomad Capitalist Live, last year, he couldn't stop talking about one country, the Central Asian nation of Uzbekistan. I've been hearing a lot of talk about this for years, from frontier market investors to major bankers. But here's what Jim Rogers had to say.
The Soviet Union had many Soviet states. They ruined Uzbekistan, but now the people running Uzbekistan are running it the way you and I would run a country, and I'm investing there. I hope it's going to be an exciting place to invest.
And I was so excited about Uzbekistan that for Nomad Capitalist Live 2024, we're bringing in multiple different panels of emerging and frontier market experts, some of who are also heavily investing in Uzbekistan, because I want you to learn what they're doing. So go to nomadcapitalist.com/live and make sure you're there with us to hear all about it. Now, I first heard about Uzbekistan a number of years ago, just as they were starting to reform their country in the late 2010s, because another country I spend time in and has done very well, both in terms of its stock market in the last year, but in terms of reforms and lowering taxes and attracting people to come, the country of Georgia. Their largest bank, TBC Bank, was opening up a new banking division in Uzbekistan. TBC Bank is basically just a Georgian company, but they were starting to go outside of their own country in one other place, and that was Uzbekistan. Today, their operations in Uzbekistan are responsible for 5% of their profits, and they're just getting started. And when it comes to emerging and frontier markets, I think it's always interesting to watch what people in the local vicinity, what people in the region are doing, because when you look up at who's investing, I saw an American who's opening up a whole cotton operation saying Americans generally are slow to come here. American banks are very slow to come here because they're very cautious. Who's not as cautious? Turkish businesses in the region. Obviously, Istanbul, a big hub, not only for flights, but for a lot of regional commerce. People there are going, just as the Turks opened up, banking operations in places like Georgia a number of years ago. Now they're going to Uzbekistan and investing in a number of different industries. Obviously, there's historically been investment from Russian businesses, but you're seeing kind of the whole Central Asian, East Asian, Middle East area with a lot more interest in Uzbekistan. This is how we generally see these things play out. I've been telling you for over a decade about Cambodia and other Southeast Asian markets. More recently, we've talked about places like Bangladesh. Where are these places seeing investment? Not from the US, not from Europe. That's probably why, if you live in those Western countries, you haven't heard of them, because you generally see investment in these frontier markets from regional companies first. And so by the time you hear about it, it's perhaps a little bit too late. So let me tell you what happened several years ago in the late 2010s in Uzbekistan. They went through and did a ton of reforms. They basically cut taxes by about half, with personal income tax rates going down to 12%. Where else did we see that? We saw that in Georgia, where the former president of Georgia, who spoke at Nomad Capitalist Live 2021, came in and basically took a wrecking ball to taxes in the early 2000s. That spurred a lot of things in Georgia. The IMF and all the powers that be said it would tank the country. It created a lot of economic activity. It's one reason why people like myself went there. And a lot of you have gone there and invested. Uzbekistan is following a similar playbook. 12% personal income tax is even lower than what you pay in Georgia. That's a pretty low rate of income tax. Banks were privatized. Reforms were brought into the labor market, making it easier to hire people. One of the things that I saw years ago was that the real estate market was open. There were, as is in the case of a number of Asian countries, some restrictions put in terms of here's how much you have to spend. So like $72,000, something like that was the number that I initially saw. And even in terms of their own citizens, up until 2019, you had to get an exit permit if you were a citizen to leave Uzbekistan. In 2017, they basically said, hey, we're going to get rid of that. And in 2019, it came true. So everything from banks to labor to foreign real estate ownership to how your passport works and, of course, dramatically lowering of your taxes, that was part of the reform that was brought into place. And so what's interesting about Uzbekistan is that about 60% of the population is 30 years old or younger. People talk about Africa as being kind of a final frontier of investment, but Central Asia is this very little discussed part of the world. People think Asia, they think East Asia, maybe Southeast Asia. They think of the Gulf as being different. What's the one part of Asia that really doesn't get much attention? It's Central Asia and Mongolia. Mongolia had a lot of press about it in the frontier market community about 10 years ago, but the bigger issue was there just wasn't really much of a domestic market. You've got a very tiny population. You've got a larger domestic market in Uzbekistan with about 36 million people. So that's about 12 times the size of Mongolia. It's certainly not as big as a place like Bangladesh, but that's on par with Malaysia, for example. It's about twice the size of a place like Cambodia. So it's not a huge country, but there are a number of resources there. One of the things that's talked about is agriculture. Obviously, you've got a growing population, you need agriculture. You've got foreign businesses coming in and doing that. You've also got foreign businesses coming in and creating efficiencies in things like the cotton and the textile markets. What are we seeing? Let's talk about, for example, under the Trump administration, U.S. and China trade war. What's happening now? Fewer businesses sourcing things like, textiles from China. Where's that going? Well, it's going to places like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, like Mexico. Perhaps there's an opportunity for some of these other players. No doubt the geography being landlocked, not as advantageous, but you are, closer, and particularly with, China, Belt and Road, and all the different things that are going on. Agriculture being modernized. You're also seeing, startups in fintech, e-commerce, software, where you're seeing foreign investment. Now, Nomad Capitalist Live 2024. As I said, we're bringing a couple of people who are actually investing in Uzbekistan as well as other frontier markets. Here's what one of them says about his multi-million-dollar investment in the country.
Now, the three areas that we focus on are: one, fintech; two, marketplaces, typically e-commerce marketplaces; and software. Since we've invested, on average, those companies have seen their revenues grow nearly 3 times in that period. And we believe there's still a very long runway to go.
So for me, emerging markets, and even more so frontier markets, are interesting because they're uncorrelated. People say, oh, when the U.S. stock market catches the cold, the rest of the world gets, they sneeze? I don't know what happens. There's some saying that, we have to make sure that we don't have any reason to want to leave the United States and all of our money should stay there. We should keep all of our eggs in one basket. But if you look at frontier markets, for example, what's the one I've been talking about for the longest period of time? Cambodia. During COVID, there was a downturn, obviously. Other than that, for over 30 years, no recession. There were recessions in Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, China. Terrible time in the late 90s. Didn't impact Cambodia. Why? You're starting from such a low base. They just keep growing. Global recession didn't affect Cambodia. So these frontier markets are often resilient to some of the events that happen in other parts of the world. There is a lack of correlation. So you can diversify into these. I'm not saying you're putting all your money into Uzbekistan or all your money into Cambodia. But I'm saying is you're getting something that is different. Here's a fact that I found interesting, because this shows the country is different. It's a different part of your portfolio. Exports as a percentage of GDP are not that high, 19%. This is not a huge export-driven economy. Obviously, again, some of the stuff they're trying to do is you're trying to basically raise the base for the current population. But exports, just in general, not that high. Room for growth. Central Asia in general is similar, but Kazakhstan, I think it's about double that. Exports to the U.S. and EU are extremely low, less than 10% of total exports. And so historical ties to Russia. Obviously, you've got decent proximity to China, India. You're pretty close to that circle of where more population lives inside this circle than lives outside of it. And as China, India, even some of the countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Thailand will, in our lifetimes, have 100 million people. They need resources. Uzbekistan can provide some of those resources. And again, they're just kind of building up the entire infrastructure in many cases where it wasn't an open country. And so what Jim Rogers told us at Nomad Capitalist Live is he wants to be in places that are just coming off, the worst that you can get. That's when you make great fortunes. He's saying, where is there a war? Where was somewhere just totally, closed off? And up until about 5 years ago, that was Uzbekistan. Now, how can you play the rise of Uzbekistan? Again, I want you to come to Nomad Capitalist Live 2024 and see not just Uzbekistan, but all the emerging and frontier markets that we have experts, about half a dozen of them, coming to talk about on multiple panels and speeches. Number one, you can buy TBC stock. I'm not giving you investment advice. I'm just telling you what you can do. TBC Bank stock trades on the London Stock Exchange. There are private funds out there. We can't recommend those, but you can go out and find private funds that invest in Uzbekistan. So private funds that buy the equities locally. Obviously, the stock markets in some of these countries, not that developed. Some of them are private equity. You can go out and find private funds and invest in Uzbekistan. Perhaps it's more of a pan-frontier Asia fund or a pan-Central Asia fund where you're invested in different markets, but you can do that. You can buy real estate. So 70,000 up to 150,000 plus, depending on where you're going, would be what they want you to spend. And if you're younger or more adventurous and you'd like to start a business, you can get a residence permit for doing that if you're doing that at a higher level. I did mention that there are people from the United States, for example, who have gone and they're bringing U.S. equipment, they're bringing U.S. know-how, and they're modernizing sectors that just weren't that modernized. I mean, again, you're starting at a very low base. And so if you say, we're going to modernize agriculture, there was one guy bringing in equipment and everything's now automated. And so just the output is through the roof. So there's businesses that can be started. This is the kind of country where, the person who opens an ice cream store and, opens up 20 of them, from 1 to 2 to 10 to 20, that person's going to become a millionaire. And there's not going to be much competition. Now, obviously, in any frontier market, things are at times a little interesting. There's a good book called Why Sell Tacos in Africa that talks about one guy's journey of building businesses in the Baltics right after the fall of the Soviet Union. There are things you have to adjust to, different cultures, a lot of things, right? But if we look at the model of Georgia, it became pretty easy. If I look at all the places where I spend time, it's not difficult to get products into Georgia. It's not expensive to get products into Georgia. The government is relatively easy to deal with. And so if that's the model that Uzbekistan is following, that's going to be a great advantage in terms of you wanting to get stuff done. Labor modernizations were made, so they made things easier. Taxes are lower. So a lot of the stuff that gets in people's way in these countries, like in a lot of African markets, for example, where the government is a headwind, is a tailwind to neutral, perhaps, in a country like with what Uzbekistan's doing. So you can buy stock, you can buy private funds, you can buy real estate, or you can start a business. If you want to buy real estate, $300,000 in Tashkent gets you a residence permit 5 years or 10 years if you are over, I think it's 60. So that's not an insignificant amount. You can buy that amount of real estate in Greece and get a golden visa and potentially have a tax advantage, and you might actually want to live in Greece. And ostensibly, you can work towards citizenship in Greece. So that's not exactly a low amount. But your investment in Greece is probably not going to go up very much. It's more of a lifestyle purchase. You want to live in a seaside town. In Tashkent, you're getting more of the stability of being in the capital city, but you're still potentially participating in a lot of the growth. If I look back over the last 10 years of real estate prices in Georgia, they've tripled in some cases. You were buying very, very cheap real estate in Tbilisi, Georgia, about 10 years ago. Samarkand and other secondary markets, $200,000 investment. Obviously, Uzbekistan is becoming, for adventure travelers, very popular place, just gorgeous places to visit all around the country. And so if nothing else, just go and check it out. That's what Jim Rogers said. Just go and enjoy yourself. Samarkand and secondary cities, $200,000 in real estate gets you a residence permit. And then if you want to buy real estate in the west of the country, $100,000 in the stan within a stan, they call it. This is hard to pronounce. The Republic of Karakalpakstan. So that's kind of the western part of the country. Obviously needs a lot more development. Potentially, I don't know if you're buying residential real estate, potentially you could buy something and build some kind of commercial facility or do something. I think people who have some vision can make a lot of money in a country like this. And if you just want a residence permit in a far-flung country that is non-correlated, it could be interesting to buy something in the capital and just hold it as part of your portfolio. I'm not saying you have to live there. So those aren't necessarily the lowest, residence by investment prices. However, if you there's different numbers that have been thrown out, from kind of lower to mid 6 figures up to a couple million. There are various options for investors in businesses. So that's not necessarily for the guy who wants to open an ice cream parlor and then build that into a business. That's more for, I'm coming to modernize your agriculture. But there are some opportunities for that. There was a discussion of a citizenship by investment program. There was talks it was going to be very expensive. I don't know that many people would have been interested, and nothing ever really came of that. So I think this is the kind of country that if you want to make an investment, and that ties in with getting a residence permit, I'm not suggesting you live there, but having the optionality to live in kind of a remote Central Asian place, I think the economic future is going to be much stronger. But I think from an investment perspective, obviously do your own research. TBC Bank is seeing some real results from what they're doing. They saw this country's modernizing, And they'd seen that playbook in Georgia. So if you're looking for a place that may not be the next Singapore, but might really develop and be the next Georgia, and people are going to find some 3, 5, 10x returns in a very interesting market. Perhaps in some of the equities you can do even better, in some of the private funds. Uzbekistan is one that we're looking at. And so if you want to learn about all the different frontier markets, Nomad Capitalist Live is our annual live event. We really are putting a big focus this year into capitalism. We're still talking about how to lower your taxes and all the places you can live. We're still talking about offshore structures and asset protection. We're still talking about passports, including residence permits and passports in weird but interesting places like this. But we're bringing in more investors, more business people, more experts, not only from the crypto space, but we've got, as I said, about half a dozen different people investing in a serious way, like real capital deployment. Africa, Uzbekistan, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, India, Indonesia, places all over the world, Latin America as well. So if you want to learn all the hot spots to invest, you come to Nomad Capitalist Live. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/live. You meet hundreds of folks from all over the world who share your values, who want to go where you're treated best. You get to meet me. You get to meet Nigel Farage. The CEO of AirAsia is going to be there. So we've got some real heavy hitters. And of course, if you work with Nomad Capitalist as a client, we keep you up to date with all the kind of things on the latest residence permits, banks, all the opportunities, including in further afield markets for people who want to dip a toe in. Just go to nomadcapitalist.com and you'll learn all about it.